first of all, let me emphasize that it is really a huge honor to me that the organizers were willing that I have the possibility to take over Wolfgang Schramm's call, who got a hip replacement 4 weeks ago. And you can be sure he will be here for the next meeting. And it's especially an honor to me that I can take over in Romania, as this country is so close to Wolfgang, and Wolfgang is so close to Romania. So we agreed on the slides here, so he has been involved in developing the messages here, and we slightly changed the title. So it's not any longer the clinical perspective, it's more the perspective from clinicians' sides. So that's what we realized in the last 15 realized in the last 15 years, that there is already a transition ongoing. So, and there is a shift from only focusing on the clinical side, that as well on the economic side. So that means the pressure of third-party payers has increasingly developed in the last years. The payers all over Europe started to think about cost-effectiveness ratios when we talked about cost-effectiveness studies, when we measured in terms like Brian presented in cost per quality adjusted life years or cost per avoided health outcomes, significant adverse health outcomes. So nowadays, policymakers and payers increasingly mandating, influencing doctors. They want to tell them what kind of treatments have to be prescribed, and often this is in the context of cost-effectiveness issues. And we also observe in European countries that there is, in a lot of cases, a greater collaboration with healthcare payers and providers. We have never expected that, for example, in Germany, that payers will sit together with clinicians and that they together start writing up quality criteria, and these quality criteria will finally discussed in reimbursement discussions. We are very happy that is actually not that often the case in hemophilia, but we observe this in a lot of other rare diseases, for example, in other hematological diseases. And at the same time, when the payers try to influence the prescribing of physicians, we see that other bodies start asking for value-based decision-making. And in this area, they developed a lot of different ideas to make or to put pressure on clinicians to justify on methodological approaches their behavior. And at the end, we come to the situation that the autonomy of clinicians has been decreasing in the last years. And I think, or we believe, this is not a very good situation because we are not struggling with the same length of weapons. So the clinician's experience and the knowledge about the disease and the treatment is so important in this overall decision-making here that we have to identify strategies how we can change this situation, and we came up to a real collaboration with payers in the future. So let me mention here three of the most famous trends we observe in European countries, but as well in the US. They are called comparative effectiveness research. This is a tool developed in the US. And in the context of comparative effectiveness research, payers focus on the one side on high evidence-based treatment programs, and on the other hand, they merge the high evidence level outcomes with the associated costs, compared, for example, to standard treatment when we talk about innovative treatments. Evidence-based medicine, this is very closely linked to comparative effectiveness research. This is a method where we investigate in reviewing and analyzing studies outside in the field, and the overall objective of evidence-based medicine is to present the different levels of quality of published studies. HTA is almost the same. So HTA is focusing on as well published literature and here in the HTA programs, we also have underlying, very well described methodology at these times. Why do we talk about this here? We can say, okay, this is only academic, scientific vision for the future. That's what we believed for a long time, for example, in Germany. We thought, okay, this is nice to have. It's a good idea that we have an idea if research is appropriate or not appropriate, or if this should be the basis for value-based decision-making. But we have learned in Germany that this kind of research is not any longer sitting in academic institutions. This is actually the truth. We have a new law in Germany, and this law requires that every company that will launch a new market in a new innovative product in the German market has to submit a benefit dossier, and within this benefit dossier, the company has exactly described what the additional benefit of this innovative treatment is compared to the actual standard therapy. And this is a quite challenging question, because so far there is absolute intransparency about the standard therapy, the outcome of the standard therapy, and at the time of launch, it's often the situation that the manufacturer has the study results of the randomized clinical trials or phase 3 studies, but not a comparison against the standard therapy in this specific country. And as you see here in the slide, this is not only the situation or a single situation, unique situation for Germany. We observe a comparable situation in UK as well in the US. So this is an overall trend we observe, which should support administrators, payers, regulatories to find a solution in societies where we have financial crisis and we do not have, or we have only a certain budget that we can allocate to different diseases. So that means as well we compete not only in between a different disease, in a single disease area against different treatments. We also opened up the competition against diseases, each other. So, and in that context, we thought it might be worth to be prepared for these upcoming discussions. And in the context of a European meeting that happened this year in April, we prepared a kind of HTA appraisal or HTA report, and we started with hemophilia B. So that's what we did. There was a systematic literature review, and this has been based on the methodological requirements of most of the European regulatory bodies or payers. The reason for this work was not that we wanted to blame, to say, oh, there's only a limited number of RCT studies in hemophilia, there is only a number of comparative observational studies. So we thought it might be worth to have something in our hands we can argue, yeah, because there is a quite good reason why we do not have tons of RCTs in hemophilia. There is a reason why these study designs in the past have been as they are. So, and we thought it might be good to be prepared for these upcoming discussions. The methodology, I already said this, we used is described in published papers by these agencies, for example, the IQWiC institution in Germany, but as well in Sweden. We know that there is a very well-known health technology group. They are trained especially or also in hemophilia, to do these kind of reviews. We went back to them, and we ran then our own systematic literature review. We used Embase to identify the literature, as well Medline and clinicaltrials.gov. In a second step after the literature review and analyzing the literature, we did also a analysis on the different evidence levels of these studies to have a final idea about the different evidence levels outside in the hemophilia literature. So why have we done this? Because most of these official payers, or these payers, they require or they plan to do decision making on high-level evidence. So, and for that reason, it is also important for us to know where do we stand at this point. Here, I do not want to go into too much detail here on the inclusion-exclusion criteria. I only want to emphasize here that we exactly use their methods, that we carefully described what we have done in this literature review, and it's also very important to have these kind of inclusion-exclusion criteria that you understand, and at the end, that's what you have produced. And this is so important because often these agencies, they do the same, but at the end, they come out with a result, and it's really difficult to understand what they've done. Yeah, but if we will not have from the clinician side nothing in our hands, we cannot argue with them. Yeah, so our idea is to have an appraisal like they will have, and then we can start a discussion, as I said, hopefully with weapons with the same length. So, and yeah. This whole approach is really time-intensive and cost-intensive. And to be honest, we have underestimated that because in Germany, and I think in a lot of other healthcare systems, you might have the same situation. Clinicians in German hospitals and university hospitals, they have to cover both patients' care and as research. And to do that stuff, beside your clinical care of patients, this is not doable. And I think this is also a question for the future. Who should take over this kind of research? And at the end, who will understand the data that has been found by all this literature research? And our final conclusion is, at the end, it is very important that clinicians who understand the treatment have to be around the table to interpret the data. Yeah? So we started here, for example, with 1,639 publications we identified by using upfront defined mesh terms. And at the end, we came up according or following the HTA process described by the IQWiC institution and the Swedish HTA bodies. We came up with 31 journal articles and 62 conference abstracts for hemophilia B that we could use for final analysis. And this slide will give you only a very brief idea what we identified. So, as I already said, it is not surprising that there are not so many randomized clinical trials in this field. And the most part of the studies we identified have been prospective observational studies with no comparators. This is as well not surprising, but I think this brings us in a very defensive situation. So the new drugs will be launched in the near future, and we have seen that we have this literature out at this moment, and this is our argumentation now for future cost argumentations. So that's what we now identify as a gap, and I don't think that we can find a solution today, but I want to bring up the idea here that maybe we should create some groups, some scientific groups, yeah, that we create communication strategies how to handle this situation, because we have the situation in Germany. Our bodies are actually writing up a report. It's still not published, but what will happen when they came with the same results, and they will let us know, hey guys, there are only a number of RCTs, and the second number of publications is not compared to any comparator, so the evidence level from their perspective is quite low. But as I said, there are some reasons for this situation, because the number of patients is low, the patients are so different, the patient have to be treated on an individual patient basis, and that's what needed is a argumentation to give them a pushback on that side. Because at the end, healthcare is as well a kind of political decision making. This slide we do not have to go in depth, but this slide in overall will give you the same message here. When you review all these actually published abstracts last year and this year, the first quarters of this year, you will observe the same situation. There is one thing I have to emphasize with respect to the conference abstracts. We haven't found any abstract that is referring on hard clinical outcome data. And this is as well a crucial point when we talk about later on justifying costs, because payers are asking for hard clinical outcome data, and as I said, often also compared to standard therapy. But here we see, when we review the abstracts published last year and this year, most of the studies were referring on safety, efficacy, PK of a factor 9. So the question is where we are with hard clinical outcome data, and when we have a look, on the last bar here, is we have not so much in hands with respect to resource consumption, quality of life, compliance studies. So in this area, there is still a lack, and I think we have to hurry up a little bit for the time when we have to argue for reimbursement and at the end access to factor 9 treatment in European countries. This slide gives you a very brief impression on the level of the evidence. We reviewed the level of the evidence according grade, for example. This is also something required in the documents I already mentioned. And here you see we have only 2 studies identified with really high level of evidence degrees. All the others are, from the perspective of these HDI bodies, moderate to low. Now, let me conclude with this slide here. So what does that mean for the future? So we have something out. We have a lot of publications. We have to structure these publications. We started to do that in this very single case, Hemophilia B. And the big question is, what is the status quo about evidence needs in Hemophilia A? And we mentioned here some of the main outstanding questions. So where can we get our data for, to summarize messages on unmet medical needs, for example? And this has been also mentioned in the first talks of this session. The same is treatment patterns. We have to identify on a structured methodological way treatment patterns. The same is for patient journeys. Often patients are not only treated in a single center. They see maybe the specialist and as well their GP. Then the question is about treatment-associated outcomes, and I'm not talking about surrogate outcomes. It's really important for the future to measure hard clinical outcomes, and still the question is open. Is bleeding the hard clinical outcome, or is it the damaged joint the hard clinical outcome? What is the clinical outcome? And hopefully we will have discussions in the future about the responsibility. Also, we have to have ideas about that. Who will be responsible for this kind of data collection? Who will finance this kind of data collection? As I said, it took us a lot of time, a lot of resources to do a small literature review. Who can get access to the data in the future? This kind of very important data for a small number of patients. Data privacy. Who owns the data at the end? And the question is methodological aspects. Can we link different data? In the UK, I observed that some institutions are already doing linkage, but these are really challenging questions, and we can solve these questions or find answers on these questions only together. And this, I think, at this point, I follow as well the other speakers. So we need close cooperation between different stakeholders, patients, groups, clinicians, industry, and finally also the payers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Karin.